Hello, I've had some questions about the third temple, and it seems like there's some confusion about the third temple, what it is, and the first and second temple. So I just want to do this short little teaching about the temples and the history that is associated with the first temple, the second temple, and what is the third temple. Now, when God used Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, out of Egyptian bondage, God called Moses up to Mount Sinai, and he met with him there, and he gave Moses some very strict instructions about what Moses needed to do. He gave him the law, the tablets of the law. And he gave him specific instructions on building a sanctuary, a place where God would meet with his people. God desires to meet with his people. So in Exodus 25:8, we read, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." God wanted a sanctuary where he could meet with his people. And so Moses and the Hebrews built the tabernacle. This is the tabernacle in the wilderness that you've probably heard about. Now, this tabernacle, a tabernacle is a tent. It's a temporary dwelling. It was never meant to be permanent. And as the Hebrews wandered about in the wilderness for 40 years because of their rebellion, they were notorious for rebelling against God, who had blessed them so abundantly. But as they wandered about in the wilderness, this tabernacle could be packed up, although it was a pretty monumental task, could be packed up and carried with them. Now, this tabernacle, and I'm going to try to get a pencil or a marker here so you can kind of follow along with me. On this there was an outside curtain here that you can see with the whole length and breadth, and people didn't just wander in here. This was considered to be a very sacred place. They would bring their animals right up here to this front area where they would lay their hand on the animal, and the priest would they would lay their hand on the animal to basically transfer their sins and or to bring their offering. The priest would bring the animal over here to where it would be tied on each corner. It's called the horns. They would tie the animal to the horns. There they would sacrifice the animal, and their blood would be gathered in this basin here, and the blood would be used for the atonement of sins. You know, a lot of people have a very sterile imagination of what happened within the tabernacle and within the temple, but it was more or less like a slaughterhouse. The animals were killed, and if you've ever been in a slaughterhouse, you know that there is an odor there. But back here in the actual tabernacle, the front part, this part here, would be the holy place. And in this holy place would be the table of showbread. There would be the golden altar, the menorah that would continually burn. It would never go out. Now, back in the back of it, behind the holy place, and it was separated by a veil where you couldn't see through. And back here in this holy place would be the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to talk about that next. Now, I want to point out that in the wilderness, it was a huge encampment because there were over 1 million people that came out of Egypt, and there are some people who think it was maybe even as many as 2 million people that Moses led out of Egypt. There were a lot of Egyptians who came out of Egypt that came with the Hebrews. But in their encampment, these are all tents. As you can see here, these are all tents. And the 12 tribes, they would separate into the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. For example, the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Issachar, the tribe of Zebulun, I mean, it just went on and on for the 12 tribes. They would, because the tribes stayed together. Each of the tribes stayed together in this encampment. And there had to be organization for this many people. And those who were not of the Hebrews, their camps were outside of the Hebrew encampment. But you can see how they were set up, and as they would, when it came time to pack up and move on, wherever they would go, they would take this same model, and that's how they would set up their camps. Now, in the most holy place at the back of the tabernacle, behind the veil, would be the Ark of the Covenant. And you've probably, if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Ark, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you've probably seen this image. But God told Moses specifically to build this Ark of the Covenant, gave him exact measurements. It was covered with gold. These cherubim on the top were all of gold. And the very top part of it, this lid, this is called the mercy seat. And in Exodus 25:22, God said, "And I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony." God's presence would come to rest between the wings of the cherubim on the mercy seat. And while Moses could commune with God, the Bible says that Moses communed with God face to face as a man speaks with his friend. Now, Moses is the only person who had that. But once a year, the high priest would go into the holy place to make the annual atonement for sin on the Day of Atonement. But this is what what an artist rendering of what the Ark of the Covenant with the top of the mercy seat and the wings of the cherubim, what that would have looked like. So that would be behind that veil in the most holy place. Now, in the 40th chapter of the book of Exodus, we find that the tabernacle has been completed. Everything is in its place. And the glory of the Lord comes into the holy place there between the wings of the cherubim on the mercy seat. In Exodus 40:34, it says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." What an amazing thing that must have been to witness the glory of the Lord coming into that tabernacle. Now, the first temple, when David became king, he built for himself a magnificent palace. But it was the desire of David's heart that God not live in a tabernacle, that God's glory was not in this temporary structure, the tabernacle, which was outside the city of Jerusalem at that time. It was David's desire that a temple, a beautiful temple, be built for the glory of the Lord to dwell in. But God told David that he had been a man of war and had shed much blood. And so the ability to build the temple, the privilege of building the temple, was not given to David. It was given to David's son Solomon. And so Solomon built the first temple. And that temple was built on Mount Moriah. David had purchased the threshing floor of Ornan on Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah was the place where Abraham had taken Isaac to be sacrificed. And you know the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, which didn't happen. God provided a ram, but it was the very same place where Abraham had brought Isaac, where the threshing floor of Ornan now was, David purchased for the building of the temple on Mount Moriah. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 1, we read, when Solomon had finished praying, this was at the dedication of this beautiful temple that he had built for the Lord. Now remember, the glory of the Lord is still in the tabernacle. When Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The glory of the Lord moved from the tabernacle to the temple. But because of their sin, their idolatry, they worshiped all these false idols. Because Israel had fallen into such sin and angered the Lord, the glory of the Lord left the temple in 586 BC. And you can read about that in Ezekiel chapters 8 through 11. It's probably, in my view, one of the saddest things that you can read about. You know, Israel kept rebelling against God, and he was so merciful, so extended his grace so many times, trying to bring them back to him. But they rebelled. They were idolatrous, and the glory left the temple. And I just want to get my marker here for a second. And Ezekiel tells about how he saw the glory of the Lord move away from the most holy place, from between the wings of the cherubim, how it came out through the doors, over the threshold of the doors, out through the gates, through the eastern gate, out over the Kidron Valley, over to the Mount of Olives, and from there up into heaven. One of the saddest things to think the glory of the Lord left Israel. Now, it not only left the holy place of the temple, not only left the temple, it left Jerusalem, and it left the nation of Israel. Very sad. And after the glory of the Lord left the temple, God's wrath allowed the Babylonians to invade the nation of Israel. It was led by King Nebuchadnezzar. They invaded Israel. They invaded Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple and they tore up the city. But Solomon's temple was completely destroyed, and they carried away a lot of the instruments and the furniture and the furnishings of Solomon's temple. And by the way, that's when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken captive into Babylon, and where Daniel served the kings of Babylon for 70 years. But after the destruction of Solomon's temple, and after the 70 years of captivity, King Cyrus released the Jews. They could go back to their homeland. And while many stayed in Babylon, others went back to Jerusalem. And in 516 BC, Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Jerusalem, and Joshua, who was the high priest at that time, they finished rebuilding a temple. Now, it wasn't anything like Solomon's magnificent temple. It was more of a simple structure with a holy place and a most holy place where they could worship the Lord. It was on Mount Moriah where Solomon's temple had stood, but it was not the same palatial structure. For one thing, they didn't have all of the gold. They didn't have all of the money that they needed to build a magnificent structure, and they didn't have the manpower because Jerusalem was, they didn't all come back. But Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua rebuilt a second temple for the worship of the Lord. Now, when Herod the Great came into power and over his rulership over Jerusalem, he expanded on Zerubbabel and Joshua's humble temple. And what Herod built is probably what we're most familiar with, what we think about, because that's the temple that was during Jesus' time. It was a magnificent thing. It covered 35 acres. Herod spared no expense when it came to building this. It was one of his prize feats of architecture. It was just a grand, grand thing. Expansion began in 20 BC all the way through 63 AD. And like I said, this is the temple of Jesus' time. This is the temple that Jesus cleansed the money changers from. This is the temple where he came to teach when he was 12 years old, where Joseph and Mary found him teaching here at this temple. But this temple, this was Herod's temple. This is the second temple, but it's just an expansion. It's not a third temple. It's just an expansion of the temple that Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, had built. Now, in 70 AD, just as Jesus prophesied, the temple, Herod's big expansive temple, was completely destroyed when the Romans, led by Emperor Titus, tore down every single stone. They carried off the golden menorah and the sacred vessels. They burned the city and the temple. Millions of Jews were slaughtered, and the survivors were dispersed all over the world. Very few Jews remained in Israel, in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount today is occupied by the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Israel does not have control of the Temple Mount. This is Mount Moriah. Folks, this is where Abraham brought Isaac. This is where Solomon's temple stood. This is where Zerubbabel's humble temple stood. This is where Herod expanded on that temple. But today, it is not occupied by the Jews. Now, why do we believe a third temple will be built? Well, many people, both Jew and Gentile, believe that a literal third temple will eventually be built in Jerusalem. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has been working feverishly over the years in preparation for the third temple. Priests have been identified through DNA. They've been trained, and they're ready to spring into action. The golden menorah, the table of shewbread, the golden altar, and all the tools and vessels for sacrifice and service have all been meticulously recreated according to biblical records. The Jews believe that the third temple must be built for their coming Messiah. Those who believe in Bible prophecy look to Matthew 24:15 as Jesus quotes the book of Daniel in prophesying that the Antichrist will commit the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation was a desecration of the holy place of the temple. For the Antichrist to commit this act, there must first be a temple to desecrate. Now, will it be a monumental structure, such as Solomon's temple, or Herod's expansion of the second temple? Or will it be a simple structure, such as what was built by Zerubbabel and Joshua? Well, we don't know, but we will keep watch